Hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Society podcast at KCL plus 380. Today we're welcoming Dr. Marc Berenson, who is a senior lecturer at the King's Russia Institute. Among the module he teaches is the Ukrainian Contemporary Politics and Society, which is available to students in their final year. Prior to joining King's, Dr. Marc Berenson founded and directed from 1996 to 1998 the Law in Action program for Freedom House in Kyiv, Ukraine, before receiving his PhD in political science from Princeton University in 2006. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So, Marc, our first question will be, can you tell us a little bit more about your time in Kyiv while you were working in a Freedom House, and what was your first impression of Ukraine and its people?
So I got there in 1996. I'm from Atlanta, and I came a few days after the Atlanta Olympics had closed. And of course, it was summer. Kyiv is a very beautiful city, probably one of the top three cities for me in the world, including hometowns. And I have been going back almost every year up until COVID hit, and now the war has also curtailed my trips there. But people were very friendly, very outgoing, very curious as well. And it sort of was a contrast to other places I had been, such as in Russia, where people were a bit more reserved on the street, so to speak. And we did a phenomenal number of projects given our small budget and small staff. We gave out small grants to local human rights NGOs. We had a series of conferences focused on different human rights and rule of law issues, such as how to provide for freedom of the press, and also how the judiciary can be covered by local press in order to explain to citizens what is going on with their court system. Also had a series of events regarding the return of deported peoples from Central Asia back to Ukraine, especially to Crimea. A number of Crimean Tatars have begun to make the journey back to Ukraine after their parents and ancestors have been deported to Central Asia during the Stalin era. At the same time, the pace of reform in Ukraine was not going much of anywhere. There's very slow initiative to sort of start a lot of the needed economic reforms. Certainly there had been currency reform. Just as I arrived, the coupons were being replaced by the hryvnia, and everyone was excited to see what the new hryvnia notes looked like at the time. But other reforms were not going as fast. And of course, the country was pretty much impoverished. It was wonderful to be an expat there at the time. You could walk into practically, after you'd lived there 6 months, you could walk into any bar or restaurant and recognize about half the people there, because there weren't that many foreigners, and there weren't that many people who could afford to eat out at the time. But for the average citizen, it was really quite a challenging time. And you saw this in terms of how people were faring on the street, in terms of what they could afford to buy, and the types of food products that were available to them. So, I miss those times in terms of having a prolonged time of being in Ukraine and traveling around the country as well. But at the same time, the country a decade later was much better off.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of the feel of Ukraine and sort of the friendliness of the people, but the one thing we thought about that would be interesting to discuss is the status of the Russian language, and it being obviously the hot issue in Ukraine for a very long time, and many are now consciously thinking of switching to Ukrainian language because of the war, because of the even those who are apolitical are still feeling that they can no longer carry on speaking in Russian. So what would you say, how do you think the linguistic shift influence cultural dynamics and societal attitudes in Ukraine?
So I've been conducting surveys with the Razumkov Center all the way back to 2005, which was a year after the Orange Revolution. occurred. And we've been asking questions about preferences or native language choices or and so forth. And there's been a shift over time, no doubt, and certainly it's increased during the war, that more people are saying that their native language is Ukrainian. One wonders to what extent this can really constitute a shift, because you only grew up with the language you grew up with, so to speak, and you speak at home the language that you speak. But I think the people answering the questions are responding to some sort of maybe need within themselves to demonstrate that they're more patriotic. That the significance of the language choice as being a proxy for patriotism is certainly a strong a trend. In terms of my experience with the language, I'm not a native Russian speaker, but I learned Russian in university, and I've since been taking up Ukrainian. I found that most people in Ukraine, no matter what part of the country you were always accommodating to the conversation at hand. And there are many conversations people have where one party is speaking in Russian and the other party is speaking Ukrainian, and they both recognize this, but they both get along just fine conversing. In some respects, at the street level, Ukrainians' tolerance continues on to how people are adjusting with language, whether you're in Lviv or Eastern Ukraine. The same token, there is sort of this theory that what Ukraine has is diglossia, which is basically Ukrainians, citizens are using different languages in different circumstances at different times. I certainly saw that with the conferences that we held in Kyiv and around the country in the 90s, where our participants, human rights activists, members of parliament, members of government, and so forth, they would speak Ukrainian inside the seminar room, inside the conference room, but they'd go outside to smoke a cigarette, and they would be speaking Russian. So there's a sense there's a time and a place for these different languages, and most people know both languages, and as a result, they are able to adapt to the situation at hand. So I haven't been back, obviously, in the last couple of years due to COVID and the war, so I don't know to what extent Russian has been more phased out and Ukrainian's been more popular. Certainly within Kyiv. Kyiv was mostly a Russian-speaking city decades ago, and I think that there's increased use of Ukrainian over time, and in some ways that's natural given the ambitions of the state and forging a new independence, identity, if you will. But I haven't heard, I've heard that Ukrainian has been more commonly spoken in Kyiv, for example, than before. I have not heard instances where people were sort of turned away or turned off for speaking Russian, or that Russian's not going to be accepted. I do remember a few years ago, Lviv had a Russian-speaking day, just to demonstrate that they were not against the Russian language there.
So would you then say that sort of the language question in Ukraine is a bit overstated in terms of its significance for the development of the country?
There has been, I do think it is overstated, but I think there's also been a lot of, whether it's propaganda or media coming from Russia, but also in the West, of viewing Ukraine as if it's a former Yugoslav republic, a deeply divided state. And I've never experienced Ukraine as being a deeply divided state. If anything, all Ukrainians are kind of a bit peeved at what they get from the state and what they don't get from the state in terms of goods and services and the like. And they share that factor. They may be more supportive of the government if one politician is in charge versus another, depending upon which region the politician's from. But I think it is overstated to such an extent at certain times over the last decade that I think it's been more problematic in terms of drawing up support for Ukraine externally rather than looking at what's going on, in fact, on the street, so to speak, in Ukraine itself.
All right, that makes sense.
I feel that obviously after the full-scale invasion in the whole Ukraine, there has been like a shift in terms of language preferences and in terms of the language that you have to speak. So for example, now, especially like in Western Ukraine, if you speak Russian, you're probably gonna have some side eyes on the street, and people will probably not tell you that they judge you, but unconsciously they will judge you. But what's interesting, and I wanted to ask you whether you think that, because I've heard the narrative that if we speak Russian, we continue to consume Russian culture. So it's kind of like, while we're making a shift towards Ukrainian language, we create our own culture and create our own cultural heritage in this sense. Do you think it's something that makes sense?
I think it's something that needs to be considered, and I think it's up to Ukraine as to the people across the country as to how much Russian or how much Ukrainian and in which circumstances they'll be using one or the other is appropriate. If I think this is prolonged process of national identity building for the country, and certainly Ukraine has been perhaps promoted more than Russian over the years as a way of forming a solid identity that Ukraine is a distinct country unto itself. Whether what people's attitudes or thinking might be of others who speak Russian or speak Ukrainian in different moments, that's going to change over time. That's going to change because whether in certain circumstances Ukrainian might be more in use, but these are sort of, we make judgments as individuals anyway about what people say and what they do, regardless of whatever language they're saying it in. So I just think this is an ongoing process. And one of the things that Ukraine pretty much failed to do or didn't do that well in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union was really decide basic questions of what type of democracy it wanted to be, what type of market economy it wanted to have, and also, some of these questions regarding identity as well. And this is in some ways a delayed response. The revolutions, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, are in many ways sort of a delayed response to not having declared what type of democracy they want to have. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a question that Ukrainians need to decide amongst themselves. Through discussion, through debate, through podcasts, through radio programs and the like. I, for a while, thought that the freest Russian language media in the world was in Kyiv. Mm. And most of the publications that were published, magazines, newspapers, journals, and the like, they were published either in Russian or in Russian and Ukrainian throughout the 90s and the first decade of the Audis. And I think that the ability to have such free media relative to what was being sort of practiced in the countries to the east also was quite, I think, positive for the country as well.
You mentioned a sort of sluggish pace of reform in Ukraine, and earlier this year I read an article by The Economist titled "Patriotic Ukrainians Are Rushing to Pay Their Taxes." The article basically summarizes that Ukrainians were way more eager to pay their taxes when the full-scale invasion began. And there were a few businesses that opted out to prepay their taxes as well. I imagine this contrasts sharply with the situation back in the sort of 1990s, 2000s. So do you think that was just an impulse of patriotism that is likely to wane away as the Russian threat is sort of not as obvious, or something more than that?
So I think it's an impulse of patriotism, but also a recognition as to what the state is doing and wanting to get behind it. Now, my surveys with Razumkov Center go back to 2005, and one of the key sort of focal points of these surveys has been asking people whether they consider themselves to be taxpayers, whether they are willing to pay taxes. You can't go out and ask people on the street, maybe if you were in Finland, perhaps you could, and ask them, gee, how often do you pay your taxes on time and in full? But devised a question for the surveys asking people, would they follow the tax laws even if they personally disagreed with them, even if they personally felt them to be unfair? And Ukraine, compared to Russia and Ukraine in 2004 or 5 and 2010, was much less receptive to paying taxes. Whereas in 2004 in Poland, 83% of Poles said they would pay taxes even if they disagreed with the tax laws. And in Russia that same year, 53% said they would. In Ukraine, the figure in 2005 was 36%. And from 2005 to 2020, that figure hovered between 36 and 45%. So never there was a majority who agreed that they ought to be paying taxes, even if they disagree with the laws. But in the last couple of years, we conducted a survey in 2002, and then a year later in 2022, and a year later in 2023, and found that the figure has jumped to 64 or 60%. And these are huge jumps. And it indicates that the public is more with the state than ever before. When you ask questions about whether the public trust the state to do what is right or trust the state to treat people fairly, the figures have jumped as well since before the war. Moreover, the figure of asking people, do you trust the state to protect you, has skyrocketed from the 20s to 71 or so percent. And I think this reflection of recognizing that one should be paying one's fair due to the state is in recognition of patriotism, in recognition that the state is providing for the military, and the military is what's going to win this war. Mm-hmm. The support for the military has skyrocketed, of course, over the last couple of years during the war. And there's also probably the possibility that in this time that if people do have income, and about, say, half the people found that their incomes didn't change that much from before the war. The other half, of course, did have a significant drop. Where are you going to put your money? Their future is tied with the security of Ukraine, and so it's tied with giving money to the state. That said, Ukrainians would prefer to give money to nonprofit organizations or charities that are funding the military rather than going through paying taxes to the state. But all in all, this is a huge change. And what it portends for the future is quite promising. If and when Ukrainians are able to get the Russians out of their country, if they have a stronger relationship with their state than they had in the previous 2.5 decades or so, then they really can move mountains, if you will. They can tackle the huge problems that await them with regards to corruption. They can make the reforms necessary to get into the EU. They can begin to become what they always wanted to become and what people on the Maidan in 2004 and 2014 wanted, and that is to have a normal country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a normal, as you say, joining the EU is probably the main thing people think about when they think about having a normal country. So, would you be able to comment a little bit on the recommendation by the European Commission to start accession talks for Ukraine and Moldova? Does that reflect just a political sort of gesture, or is it more of a Ukrainian state taking a reform seriously?
From what I understand, in Brussels, the Europeans are taking the importance of bringing in Ukraine to the EU very seriously. And I think that the plans that are being drawn up for rebuilding, reconstruction of Ukraine, that certainly will get beefed up after the war, ends, they all call for this being done in tangent with joining the EU.
Mm-hmm.
The process of rebuilding has to come with the process of Ukraine entering into the EU. And that has to be something that Europeans recognize, and something that Ukrainians as well as the Europeans that they are also have to recognize that they will have a roadmap to get there, and this isn't some sort of pie in the sky dream. You know, Ukraine, for the most part, was the only country you saw people die protesting, trying to get into the EU.
Yeah.
And that needs to be recognized on the part of Brussels. Moreover, European security, European democracy is at risk as well if Ukraine is not going to win this war. And to win, there needs to have the goalpost at the end that Ukraine is becoming part of the rest of Europe.
Do you think it's possible for Ukraine to get into European Union before we win the war?
I don't know. I think that there's always going to be people who may be less informed of what's going on the ground in Ukraine and just panic at the idea of bringing in a state that's in the midst of a war. Moreover, NATO does not want to bring in Ukraine during the war.
Yeah.
There's thoughts about it doing so afterwards, but not at this time. And one of the main challenges of the last 30 years in terms of how the West was approaching Ukraine was the West was trying with a lot of support and funding to make Ukraine more democratic, to make its markets function better for the country as a whole, and to have a lot of interaction and contact with Ukrainians, bringing Ukrainians into Europe on whether they're on sort of so-called trade trips, or just in terms of greater cooperation on a variety of interstate activities. But what the West did not do was really provide for a canopy of security over Ukraine. And I think some of it, the thinking prior to 2022, was that the West didn't need to do that. Nothing serious would result from them not doing so. And, coupled with changing your economy, coupled with changing from communism to democracy, providing for security, an umbrella or a canopy, if you will, that would enable any country undertaking such a transformation to be able to continue to proceed to do so and not be interrupted by outside forces.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the West, would you say actually, if the West underestimated the threat from Russia and the sort of the actual maybe motives for their foreign policy, because we saw Nord Stream 2 being approved in Germany and sort of enhancing Germany's dependence on Russian gas, and then in 2022, as soon as the whole thing sort of fell apart and Russian tanks invaded Ukraine, Germany struggled with inflation and now the sort of less than optimal growth prospects. So would you say there was a sort of fundamental or strategic, to call it so, mistake on the part of the West?
Germany especially took a big risk. They had this foreign policy that had been formed for decades that basically said, we need to embrace and engage with Russia. That is the path towards peace and prosperity. And it didn't turn out that way. They gambled and put too much of their energy needs upon trading with Russia. And that said, however, in the last couple of years, Germany's been going somewhat swiftly through a foreign policy rethink, if you will, and is very much recognizing that the importance of supporting Ukraine, and which means supporting democracy and free markets and the rest.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that Germany probably has a greater obligation, has an obligation to support Ukraine, given the way the 20th century panned out. There's no other country that I can think of other than Ukraine that suffered more in the 20th century and had more death, state-sponsored death on its territory. You had the Holodomor, you had the Holocaust, you had World War II, and both wars actually saw the front lines shifting back and forth, crisscrossing across the country, such that Ukrainians experienced the worst of the war at least twice as the fronts moved in different directions. And most of a good number of those who fought in the Soviet army were from Ukraine. And Ukraine was an integral part of that win in 1945. And I think it's very easy to sort of assume that Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union, therefore we need to sort of handle Russia as we would our former enemy. But Ukraine itself suffered greatly as well at the hands of the Germans. And I think that they have begun to recognize that more and more just over the last 2 years. So I see foreign policy shifting greatly in Germany, but across the EU as well. Of course, there are certain circumstances like the election in Netherlands in recent days that may put obstacles for Ukraine when it comes to how EU politics gets to decide how much and when they're going to be supporting Ukraine. But in general, across the continent, there's been a solid wave of support. I've noticed this in the countries that I've visited, which have had a tremendous number of Ukrainian flags out. And so I think that will continue.
If we're talking about the West and its influence in Ukraine, many in the West, and particularly in the US, are talking about elections, re-elections, and general elections in Ukraine. What's your opinion about it? And because there is also a concern that it will not be possible to make an election, and thus it's not going to be fair. At the same time, it's not going to be fair if we're not going to have them. What do you think about it?
It is a classic dilemma. Ukraine has been and is a democracy, and the terms of office that parliament members, the president were elected to were fixed. At the same time, there are tremendous security concerns. If they were to hold elections, would the election polling stations become targets for either terrorism or airstrikes from Russia? Would it's martial law actually, as it's written, does not foresee parliamentary elections being held during a state of war. And last month they would have been held if it were not for the war in October, 4 years after the previous elections that were held in 2019. When it comes to presidential elections, the martial law is a bit vague as to whether they have to be held at set times or not. But it's a question about security. It's a question about feasibility. How are you going to determine who has a right to vote based upon the fact that many provinces have had, certainly in the East, have had a number of citizens flee either the region or the country as a whole? How are you going to determine where military personnel are going to vote, and can they vote while they're still fighting a war at the same time? There's a lot of concern, and as well, the opinion polls that I have seen is that most Ukrainians do not want to have elections held now, and the paramount reason, I think, is they don't want money spent on the elections. They want the money to be spent on fighting the war, and that's a reasonable position. And Ukraine would not be the only country that sort of pushed back elections because it was in the midst of a sort of intensive war. The question I think I have in my mind is not whether the elections should have been held last month for parliament or next spring for president, but rather how long could it go on for elections not being held. And I think that at some point democracy needs to be sort of revitalized, reinvigorated, and voting is an affirmation process as well, not just in who you vote for, but also in the state and the country in which you're voting as well. So I've also seen maybe anecdotes or stories that if a war lasts 2 years, the likelihood of it lasting 10 years grows up incredibly. And obviously all of us would fear for a war that would go on for so many years in Ukraine. But it would be hard to imagine that the current crop of politicians would perhaps even want to be in office for 10 years without an election being held. I think it's important to have them at some point, perhaps in the discussions about whether to postpone the next elections for president in the spring, might come with some sort of promise or discussion about when they might be held, so that the citizens have some sort of understanding from their government as to what's going on.
There are some fears that certain US or maybe just Western politicians as a whole will use Ukraine not holding elections as a pretext to cut aid, and that will be exacerbated even more if Donald Trump is back in power in 2024. What would you say to that?
I think there are a number of politicians in the U.S., not a majority, but a strong handful who would look for any reason not to give money to Ukraine. And it's very short-sighted. It's not in their country's interest. There's so many important reasons why the U.S. should be supporting the war effort on behalf of the Ukrainians. Least of all is that we're not having our men die or fight on the battlefield, and as long as there's a war that staves off the Russians in Ukraine, the likelihood of their having Russians wandering about the rest of Europe, which would require U.S. forces to be committed to such a fight, such a likelihood would be decreased dramatically. Also, there's other side benefits too. Most of the weapons that the U.S. sends to Ukraine come from the U.S. They come from stockpiles. They are replenished by more weapons being created at U.S. factories across the country, many of them based in Republican districts where some of the more anti-Ukrainian politicians might likely find themselves being from. And moreover, this provides for testing out these weapons on the ground without American lives being risked, in order to ascertain, and get a leap up on the next sort of stage and generation of weapons.
Going back to the sort of the general election and the whole talk of Ukraine maybe holding election in 2024. How receptive do you think the Ukrainian public is to authoritarianism? And I'm asking that because if we are to have an election during martial law and just the general state of war, the normal sort of democratic procedures are likely to not take place, because in order to have free and fair elections you need to have the opposition's voice present on the TV or generally in the media, and that seems at least to some people quite unlikely. What would you say to that?
I'm not so sure that there would be all these restrictions on and limitations on the election process that you suggest. I think that Ukraine as a population has been very independent from the state. And I think that's helped build democracy. Ukrainians have elected 6 presidents in 30 years, where their neighbors have only voted just 1 or 2 over that period of time. And they've only voted in one president back into office, and that was Kuchma. And I think that it is part of the character and nature for Ukrainians to be a bit more outspoken and a bit more circumspect with respect to whether the state is really serving their interests or not. So I can't imagine they would be quiet. I've also recognized at the moment we have in Ukraine this unified news television network in which all the news stations are sort of combined and only broadcasting just one news program throughout the day. And I think some in Ukraine might be a little bit tired of seeing just the same faces and want to have a bit more diversity. And I think that that might be, if that changes, certainly it would possibly happen in relation to the presidential campaign if it were to pick up in the spring. I could see the two, holding an election at the same time of diversifying the broadcast news would allow for that. It is hard to imagine how candidates who ran under full sort of democratic procedures, if you will, where opposition figures are given airtime, opposition parties are given time on the airwaves, and when we remember in the Olympic Stadium how Zelensky debated Poroshenko,
yeah.
and that led obviously to Zelensky's ultimate victory in that race, but it was quite competitive, and I don't think that the public would want to see an election that sort of election process that was more contained.
All right, that makes sense. Certainly, you've drawn a much more positive picture than some say at home. Sort of to finish our discussion, or near it, closer to the end, with millions of Ukrainians settling abroad because of the war, many are likely to never come back. What are your thoughts on the future role and influence of the Ukrainian diaspora in the West or elsewhere in the world?
So Ukrainians have been living abroad, for generations, and there is certainly a big uptick in the immigration from Ukraine to Western countries after World War II, especially in Canada, the US, and Australia. And these immigrants and their descendants have become the sort of very strong supporters of Ukraine from abroad. Certainly all of the sort of committee hearings that are taking place in Washington or seminars at think tanks that focus on Ukraine, there's a sizable component of the audience is our Ukrainian diaspora, and they're pushing for what Ukraine needs. So coupled with that we've had prior to the war waves of sort of more recent emigres who have gone abroad. Perhaps most of them may have gone to Poland, which is very close by, and they're able to go back to Ukraine for part of the year while working in Poland. But they've been sending remittances back home to their families, and I think that would also be helpful. Yes, a lot of Ukrainian migrants who left, refugees who left Ukraine since 2022 are quite possible likely to just stay where they are and move to a different country. But there's also a strong sort of connection and ties to Ukraine that I think a number of them will not let slip. One of the reasons why Poland got so many refugees after February 2022 was because many families would want to go to be as close by to Ukraine as possible while wives were managing their families in Poland, and their husbands were fighting back in Ukraine. They didn't want to go far, so they don't anticipate staying there for the long run. Obviously, life is full of uncertainty, and there are a lot of opportunities that may be presented to refugees in the next few years that might encourage them to stay where they are, but I think a number will go back as well.
Do you think that those that will stay will probably play a bigger role to be an advocates of Ukraine in their respective countries? Because we've seen, for example, the Jewish lobby, the Israeli lobby in the US is quite influential. Obviously not to the same extent, but would you say that some of the benefits of that Ukraine will have?
I think there are a number of Ukrainian diaspora groups, organizations that have been putting the pressure on the political sphere with respect to Ukraine in a very positive, constructive manner. I also think about how in the early 80s, after the Solidarity movement and martial law came into force in Poland, a number of young Poles in their 20s and 30s left the country to go abroad, and they didn't think they'd ever come back. And a decade later, after the Berlin Wall fell, and Poland was building a country of, by, and for Poles for the first time in generations, these Poles came back, and they came back with expertise, with knowledge, and a strong desire to help rebuild the country they had come from. Without a doubt, if the right conditions are there and the incentives are in place to encourage Ukrainians to come back after the war concludes, I would anticipate a good number of them would.
Do you think it's kind of a patriotic movement and the patriotic feeling that people experience, or because there's millions and millions of Ukrainians that went abroad in the beginning of the war and now they're coming back even though the war is still ongoing? And I'm not even talking about female, women, mothers and children, but also men who are coming back knowing that they're not going to be able to, for example, leave the country after they...
And they may have to serve.
They may have to serve as well. Yeah. In some respects, after the initial months of 2022, parts of Ukraine seem to open up a bit more. Kyiv is one place, and we see sort of a flood of diplomats and ambassadors and distinguished politicians making their trek by train from Lviv to Kyiv, and it is, I certainly have friends who go back and forth between Europe and Ukraine almost on a monthly basis, and it's possible to do this. I am not certain about how many fatalities have occurred in the last year or so in places like Kyiv, but I imagine that they are still very rare, such that most people feel as if they're able to return to some level of normalcy in their lives. And the fact that people want to come back, people come back for a variety of reasons, whether it's family, for their work, for their business. They want to have confidence that they're going to have some reasonable level of security as they do so. And I think this is positive. I also recognize early on the mayor of Kyiv was really saying we don't want people to come back quite yet because they provide for more of a challenge and difficulty to cope with so many people. But Kyiv may not be as fully populated as it was before the war, but it's more populated, I understand now, than it was at the beginning months of 2022. Yeah, definitely. I agree. People are coming back, especially to Kyiv.
Would you have any sort of final messages or even advice for Ukrainian students who are here in the UK or just generally in the West?
Be creative and think about ways perhaps that you could have an impact. There's no doubt that even if you are not located in Ukraine itself, you can make a difference. Whether it's just drawing up general support for the war, for the Ukrainians in this fight, or whether it's pushing for things that will make Ukraine a better democracy and a better economy and country for the public as a whole. To engage with others in thinking about different ways to make a difference. And I think you can, absolutely can.
And that is a good sort of point to finish our podcast. Thank you very much again to Dr. Berenson for joining us and giving your thoughts on Ukraine and everything else.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.